Attention home buyers and sellers. Most real estate agents in the country are now doing business differently than they have in the past. In a nutshell, the way brokers are compensated has changed, making the true cost of residential real estate transactions more transparent and competitive. As a result, it's going to be confusing for brokers, buyers, and sellers for a while until everyone understands the new rules. I'm Herb Weisbaum, the Consumer Man, a contributing editor at checkbook.org.
Welcome to Consumerpedia at checkbook.org. We're the nonprofit that helps consumers select services, avoid trouble, and save money. Because we don't accept any advertising or take money from any business we recommend, you can rely on checkbook.org to be completely independent and objective. Now, here's the host of Consumerpedia, America's consumer expert, the Consumer Man, Herb Weisbaum.
In this episode, a look at the new rules regarding real estate commissions, why they changed, and what it will mean to both buyers and sellers. Also, things everyone should know when you're hiring a real estate agent. We have two great guests to talk about this. Steve Robeck is a senior fellow at the Consumer Federation of America. He studied this issue for years and written numerous papers on the subject.
Good to join you, Herb.
And Ilyce Glink, an expert on real estate and personal finance advice based in Chicago. Ilyce is an award-winning columnist and blogger, talk show host, and best-selling book author, and an old friend. You can find her online at thinkglink.com.
Hey, it's nice to be here.
So the changes we're talking about in this episode resulted from a class action lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors. As part of the settlement in this case, the NAR agreed that its 1.5 million members would follow a new set of rules that governs how they get paid and who pays them when a house is sold. So Steve, let's start with a little refresher course. How did things work before the new rules took effect?
Well, Herb, in the old system, sellers compensated both their own agent and the buyer's agent. So to list a property on the local MLS, sellers had to offer to pay the compensation of the buyer agent. The total compensation was usually 5 to 6% of the final sale price. Now, on the other hand, most buyers didn't even sign a contract with their agent. If they ask about the agent's compensation, and I don't think most of them did, they were told the seller would pay it.
So let's do the math. If I sold my house for $500,000 and I'd agreed to pay my agent a 6% commission, I would owe $30,000 and my agent would split that with the buyer's agent?
Oh, that's correct.
So why was that a problem? Do you believe that raised the prices buyers paid?
Several problems. Most importantly, it allowed the industry to fix prices since buyer agent compensation couldn't really be negotiated. And that's a key reason that the rates were so high, 5 to 6%, compared to 3, 2, even 1.5% in most of Europe. Also, these rates bore little relationship to the quality of the service that consumers received, because all agents, regardless of their competence, experience, charge the same percentage. And also, all agents charge the same percentage regardless of the work that they did. A buyer agent that showed 20 houses was paid basically the same commission that a buyer agent who showed only one house.
So buyers agents use what are called multiple listing services, or MLSs, to find homes for sale. And under the new rules, National Association of Realtor members selling agents will no longer be able to advertise their commission on listings. Ilyce, how is that going to make a difference and change things, hopefully for the better?
Well, the settlement is kind of interesting, Herb. It was $418 million agreement that said brokers are not negotiating. They're supposed to negotiate. All commissions, as I've written about in my many books, all commissions are negotiable, but they weren't negotiating it. To Steve's point, things were more or less fixed, or for some agents in some places, they were fixed. The new rules are that the buyers must enter into a written agreement that guarantees how much they're going to compensate the agent ahead of time. And the seller continues to go into a listing agreement, and they're supposed to now only be responsible for the half of the commission that their seller's agent wants. So on the face of it, you think to yourself, well, it's the same amount of money. If the buyer's agent signs an agreement with the buyer and says, you'll pay me 2.5%, 3%, and the seller's agent signs an agreement that says, you're going to pay the seller's agent 2.5%, or 3%. My perspective, which is probably a little different from Steve's, is in the real world, nothing is going to change. You're still going to end up paying between 5 and 6%. And since all the money came from the buyer anyway, it's just apportioned a little bit differently. So the fact that seller's agents can't put in the multiple listing service how they're going to share that commission, sellers don't have to force agents to do it. Buyer's agents can now ask if they will be willing to share the commission. I guess in my real world perspective, I don't know how anything's going to change.
Well, let me provide a little different perspective on that. For the first time, buyers can really effectively negotiate down the commission, and they will be discouraged by buyer agents from doing so. The buyer agent will say, look, you don't have to worry about that. The seller will still pay. But if the buyers negotiate down the commission, that would then allow them to negotiate on the sale price because the seller will have to pay the buyer agent less money. Everybody agrees that there's going to be no radical change in the near future, but many people, perhaps most, think that there will be slow changes over time. For the past several years, I've predicted that the rates would come down from an average of 5 to 6%, eventually to 3 to 4%, with much greater variation in the 3 to 4%, with the really competent, successful agents being able to charge more than the less experienced agents. And you can see this actually in New York City. Outside of certain areas dominated by one of the many MLSs in New York City, the average rates are 3 to 4%.
But the thing is, Steve, and I know you've probably thought about this, I don't know any sellers who are willing to negotiate down even if they only have to pay 3% commission or 2.5% commission, which is kind of what they were responsible for anyway. In their minds, sellers say, wow, I just pocketed that extra 3%, and why would I negotiate it? On the buyer's side, you're now responsible for a commission that you have to come up with out of pocket unless you can figure out a way to finance it, which of course you and I will both agree, financing commissions is never a great idea. And so when buyers are really struggling to come up with down payments anyway, there's no guarantee the seller is going to come down on the purchase price simply because they're paying less in commission. So I guess I'm unclear. Maybe in the long run, this will all sort out where buyers pay a little bit less and sellers pay a little bit less. But I don't know. As a person who's now selling a condo, I can just tell you in the real world, nothing has changed.
Well, look, it's going to take a while for things to change. And it's going to be more important for buyers now to use a really experienced buyer agent, because if they can negotiate down, the buyers can negotiate down the buyer agent commission, say 3 to 2%. A good buyer agent should be able to negotiate down the sale price, and that will be a savings to them. In addition, as a result of all of this publicity and news coverage, sellers are now more aware that they can negotiate down the listing agent's commission. And we think that's going to come down too, from to a full percentage point eventually. So we really stick by our prediction that eventually, and it may take several years, the average commissions will come down by at least 1%, but probably closer to 2%.
So we've had discount agency in the real estate world for quite a while now, at least 20 years. And there are companies out there like Redfin that charge, 1.75%. There were other kinds of companies that piecemealed the work that they would do for buyers and sellers. And at the end of the day, it's a complicated, perhaps overcomplicated process. You and I might agree on that, where buyers and sellers end up turning to people that they think are smart and competent. But when you go to the very best agents and the ones who are busiest, they're the ones who are least likely to say, yeah, I'll only charge you 2% and not 3%, because they feel like their time is worth whatever it is. And sometimes those agents are so successful because they do put so much into a deal. My mother was a top-selling real estate agent in Chicago for many, many years. And she would say that, over the face of it, if you do 30, 40, 50 deals a year, which she was at that level, there's maybe a handful, 2 or 3, that it's one offer, they fall in love with the first thing, and then they do it and they close on that deal. Most of the deals, though, take a whole lot of time and effort and energy. And there's extra expenses that go in that I don't think that buyers and sellers fully appreciate until they're in the process. And the expenses come for new technology, like if you're going to stage virtually an apartment, for example, or a unit or a house. somebody has to be paid for that technology. So I do think that there are complications and to the industry these days that the very best agents, I don't see them negotiating on price. It would be nice if they did. And I do think it's great that people are more aware that commissions are negotiable. But I'm not sure that that's going to work in all cases.
Well, we agree that the best agents probably won't have to lower their commission at all. But most agents are not experienced. Most of them are part-time agents. I mean, the real marginal agents drain 25 to 30% of all the commission income. So they are not going to be able to charge 3%. But to the whole issue of the discounters have only a small portion of the market because they're discriminated against by the traditional agents. Take Redfin. Redfin, with a lot of enthusiasm, entered the marketplace nearly 15 years ago and wanted to charge 2.5 or 3%. They could not make a go of it at that rate because the buyer agents would not show their properties. They had to compromise and offer a full 2.5 to 3% to the buyer agents. That's going to start to change now. I think one of the long-term impacts of the settlement is going to be that it's going to empower the discount agents. You're going to see a lot more variation in the marketplace, particularly in compensation. You talked about all the different variables in terms of compensation. The price is eventually going to reflect those variables, the amount of effort that the agent put in, the competence of the agent.
So I think we can all agree that we'll see what happens down the road because there's a good chance that something will happen or nothing will happen, and we'll do another podcast in 2 years and figure it out. Steve, there are some who have warned that these changes are going to have a negative impact on the real estate market. Do you think it will?
What do you mean by negative impact? Certainly, it's taking the industry a while to adjust to the changes. I just saw a headline in one of the industry trade press that used the term mass confusion. And one of the problems is that some of the agents are not willing to change. Buyer agents are insisting that listing agents guarantee a certain percentage, 2.5%, 3% commission, whereas much, if not most of the industry is rolling with the punches and trying to adjust to the intent and the letter of the new rules and the desires and demands of the Department of Justice.
So how is all this going to change things when I go looking for a real estate professional to sell my house or to help me find a new house? We're going to dig into that next. I'm Herb Weisbaum, the Consumer Man, and this is Consumerpedia, powered by checkbook.org.
If you like what you hear, we hope you'll consider being a Consumerpedia supporter by using the link at the bottom of the show notes to make a small contribution each month. This is Consumerpedia.
The new way of doing business created by the commission rules will change the relationship in some ways between a seller and their agent. And this will mean disclosures and paperwork to sign. Ilyce, what is supposed to happen under these new rules?
Well, the buyer's agent is supposed to present a disclosure and a contract basically to buyers that says, hey, I'm your buyer's agent. I owe you a fiduciary responsibility. That means I'm on your side. I'm paraphrasing here. This is not legal jargon. And for these things that I'm going to do for you, you're going to owe me X. And you guarantee that you will pay it, or if the seller will not, is basically what it says. On the seller's side, they're already getting a listing agreement where the agent will put down the list price and talk about all the different services they'll provide and the commission. One of the dangers in this whole new scenario is that a seller might get tricked into signing a listing agreement that says they'll pay 6%, assuming that half of that is going to go over to the agent, whatever that number is, where the buyer is also signing an agreement agreeing that they will pay 2.5%. And I could imagine some scenarios where the total commission is now 6 or 7 or 8% as opposed to something a little bit less. But the disclosure forms are the things that both the buyer and the seller now are going to be required to sign.
Does it anywhere in this paperwork say, and these commission rates are completely negotiable? Are consumers told this up front in this document?
Well, that's actually one exception to our criticism. Almost all the contracts that we've looked at, yes, in bold print or large print say that the commission is negotiable.
That's good.
That's very good. Unfortunately, most of the contracts are not easily understandable. The law professor who worked with us in her analysis of the California forms, at least the early draft, said she could not understand parts of those contracts. This is a law professor who teaches contracts, couldn't understand them. So there's a lot of progress that needs to be made there.
So, Ilyce, the president of the National Association of Realtors, Kevin Sears, said he is, quote, confident that his members are ready to embrace this evolution in the real estate industry. Do you think they are?
I think that everybody wants them to be. I think that in the real world where we all live today, there's just a lot of confusion. I keep hearing and getting letters, emails from people who are, buyers and sellers confused about what they have to sign. To Steve's point, the contracts are opaque, difficult to parse. I'm married to a real estate attorney, and even when we were listing a condo recently, it was complicated. He understands it. He does it every day, but I read it and I thought, I'm not quite sure what this says. And so when we guide buyers and sellers all over the country, we have to be very careful, in saying, ask questions, make sure you really understand what it is you're being asked to do and what you're on the hook for. If you don't understand that, then you could end up on the wrong side of things.
Steve, what do you think?
One of the issues that's going to come up when buyers are asked to sign these contracts that they don't understand, and when it's explained to them that they are obligated to compensate their agent, despite any assurances the seller will pay, they're not going to do business with that agent, especially if the contract is not understandable. We've told the industry if they don't clean up those contracts, many buyers are not going to use buyer agents. And our whole system is going to evolve toward the British system, where there's essentially one facilitator, and the charges at the last survey I saw 1.2%, not 5.5, 5.6%, which is the current charge in the U.S. So there's still some huge challenges that face the industry in particular, but also regulators and consumers. We are in the middle of change, and there's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of resistance as well as acceptance of the new rules.
Well, my fear is that people, as they get handed this paperwork, are just going to sign it even though they don't understand it, and they're just going to sign it.
Well, the thing is, the agents are going to have to raise the issue of compensation, and then they're going to take it more seriously than most consumers take contracts.
It's interesting. One of the things that came up in the condo we just listed was that the listing agent, who we picked specifically for this, offered us less than 6% and said that any excess money that comes in, if the buyer is going to just separately compensate the buyer's agent, that they will return to us and reduce the commission down to about, whatever it was, half of that, so 2.5%. And I think what is new and different is that conversation happened before we signed the listing agreement.
Ilyce, that the experience you had with your listing agent who offered essentially a concession wouldn't have occurred in most cases 3 or 4 years ago. We did research, and I was pretending that I was a home seller and contacted and had fairly long conversations with some 200 listing agents. About 3/4 of those listing agents said they would not negotiate the commission at all. I think one of the impacts, and it's going to take time to occur, as a result of the settlement is that an increasing number of listing agents are going to be prepared to negotiate down the listing agreement, particularly in a dual agency situation.
Before we leave this topic, 2 things to just recap. First of all, there are going to be a lot of confusing documents used. And the other thing, getting back, Stephen, to that University of Buffalo professor, the law professor who studied some of the agreements out there, I read her paper and spoke to her. She concluded that some agents are already coming up with workarounds to go around the rules that are in place. So who's going to enforce this? I know the U.S. Justice Department is said to have launched a formal inquiry into the California Association of Realtors contracts. Is it going to be up to the DOJ and maybe state attorney generals or maybe class action lawsuits to make sure that the agents follow the new rules?
Well, the MLSs will actually have some responsibility, but really it's going to be up to the Department of Justice, but more importantly, to private attorneys. Unfortunately, a lot of attorneys now, trial lawyers, are sort of, smell blood in the water, and they're going to be much more interested and willing to litigate in the future than they have been in the past.
Up next, we're going to talk about how to hire a real estate professional, whether you're buying or selling. I'm Herb Weisbaum, and this is Consumerpedia, powered by checkbook.org.
Consumerpedia Fast facts. Slightly more than 4 million existing homes were sold in the U.S. in 2023, according to the National Association of Realtors. That's down from 6.1 million in 2021. America continues to have a housing shortage. For more than a decade, population growth has exceeded the number of new homes built. In 2023, 1.4 million new houses were built in the U.S., according to Statista. That's a 9% decrease from 2022. The most expensive property sold in 2023 was the gigantic Bluff-Top complex on top of Paradise Cover in Malibu. It sold for more than $190 million in cash. The buyers? Beyoncé and Jay-Z. According to the Robb Report, it's the most paid for a home in California and the second priciest ever recorded nationwide.
Steve, you recently wrote that the new rules provide both opportunities and risks for consumers. Your quote, knowledgeable home buyers and sellers will be able to take advantage of the opportunities and avoid the risks. So let's make sure our listeners know what to do. The Consumer Federation of America has 3 suggestions to home sellers and home buyers about how to deal with the new residential real estate marketplace. Your first suggestion, selecting a competent, honest agent is more important than ever, especially for buyers.
It's the same rule, really, for selecting an auto mechanic. You won't know whether your car needs a new transmission or not. You have to have a mechanic who you trust and who's competent. Same thing for an agent. Now, we know, according to industry studies, that a large percentage of this nearly 2 million agents are marginally competent. Some, according to the industry source, are even dishonest. So it's really important in this marketplace that's become more complicated, particularly for buyers, to find a competent agent. First of all, look for the brokers or associate brokers. They will almost always have more experience and more training than just an ordinary agent. Secondly, you can use the portals, the Zillow, Realtor.com, and Homes.com to get information on agents that you are investigating. In particular, look at whether they're active and they've sold properties, and also whether they've received favorable reviews from clients. So, we have to be aware that most of those reviews were prompted by the agents themselves. And then perhaps just as important is, and this is a test as to whether the agent is going to level with you, ask to see the contract forms right up front and ask them about the compensation.
Ilyce, you have any thoughts on that tip?
It's really about years in business, how many homes they're representing. If you're looking in the suburbs for a single family house with a big backyard, and the agent is only working in whatever city you're in condos that are $500,000 more than you can spend, it's probably not a good match. You want somebody who's not only honest, which you're never going to really know until you're in the thick of it, but somebody who matches up with what you're actually looking to spend. And then you want to get into a relationship where you really feel like you're understanding what they're saying. Because to Steve's point, if there's a lot of gibberish going over your head, you're never going to get a straight answer and really feel like you understand what you're signing.
So before we move along to tip 2, how do you start the process? We often recommend that if you're looking for a professional, you ask your neighbors who they used. Should you ask your neighbors who recently bought or sold a house, how'd you like the person you used?
In my book, I recommend that people talk to at least 3 different agents from 3 different companies. All of the companies are going to have a different perspective on how they deal with you. And you'll get a sense from talking to a few people about the differences in behavior, the differences in the way that they handle sales or purchases. And yes, sure, of course, ask friends and family members who they use. And to your point, very important thing to ask, how was your experience? Because if somebody said it was just a meh, that isn't somebody that you want to work with.
Yeah. So suggestion number 2 from the Consumer Federation of America is read and evaluate buyer or seller contracts, often called agreements, especially blanks that are filled in.
Well, a large number of the new contracts have been written by the industry. They're very difficult, if not impossible, to understand, and they contain anti-consumer provisions. So that's why it's so important to right up front, when you interview the agent, to ask to see the contract that they use and try to discuss it with them. If they won't discuss it with you, you should not use that agent.
Sure.
And if you don't understand it, maybe they can help you. Most of the successful agents and brokers, are honest and they're competent. And, by talking to them, you'll get a sense as to whether they in fact are. But if you do not understand the contract and you can't get straight answers from the agent, do not use that agent. go find somebody else. Even if you can understand the contracts, there's some red flags. If, for example, they're insisting on a mandatory arbitration, I'd be leery about signing that contract because that basically says you can't go to court. Essentially, practically, you can't go to court if you have a serious problem with the purchase or with the agent. Another red flag is if they ask you to approve dual agency in advance. So you're a seller, you're signing a contract with a listing agent, and the listing agent says, okay, if I find a buyer, you have to basically let me work as a dual agent. You lose your fiduciary representation. You want a fiduciary representative if you have an agent in a sale. And when a listing agent insists upon giving up that fiduciary relationship to you if they find a buyer, that's another red flag.
Yeah, I agree with everything Steve has said. Again, a lot of places around the country do not use real estate attorneys to help close deals. Midwest, upper Midwest, and the Northeast, they do. And again, married to a real estate attorney, so I say that up front. But I do think it's very helpful to have somebody you can call and say, can you please explain what this means? And anytime you're discouraged from seeking legal advice, I think it's a bad thing, and it doesn't help clarify the situation. But Steve is exactly right. Ask the questions. Keep asking until you feel like you understand the answer well enough to be able to turn around and explain it to a 10-year-old.
Steve, I want to ask you about one specific tip you had in this section. I actually read your whole release. Some buyer agents will press buyers to sign this commitment before showing them a property, and a few dishonest listing agents at open houses may try to do so. Also, increasingly, buyers agents will offer buyers the opportunity to sign touring agreements that do not require a financial commitment. Go through that a little bit if you would.
Well, this is part of a new rule. That was the initiative, by the way, not of CFA or the Department of Justice, but the industry's own initiative. The timing of the signing of the buyer agent agreement is really controversial, and the industry has said that it's got to be signed before an agent shows you a house. And I've had many conversations with brokers about this to say, look, that's too early. Essentially, when an agent shows you a house, they're auditioning for the job of being your fiduciary agent. So what Zillow did was, and they started talking to me about this over a year ago, they developed touring agreements, which essentially you can sign, and they're for a very short period of time, maybe for one house, maybe for one day, and they shouldn't be for any more than a week. You should feel free to sign those. And the only obligation that you'll have is if you're shown that house and you end up buying it through another agent, the first agent's going to come back and understandably ask for some compensation.
Okay. And finally, suggestion number 3 on finding a good real estate professional. Discuss and negotiate commissions and any other agreement compensation in dollar amounts, not percentages, Steve?
No, all of the litigation and brouhaha is essentially about fixed 5 to 6% rates. The good thing about the settlement, despite all of its imperfections, it really does not represent total uncoupling of the listing agent buyer agent commissions. It's a partial uncoupling, but there are opportunities there. And the big opportunity now is for the buyers to negotiate down the commissions. But what's critical is that you think about the compensation and you talk about the compensation in terms of dollars, not percentages. One of the reasons that I believe the industry's been able to charge 5 to 6% is 5 to 6% doesn't sound like very much. On the other hand, used the example earlier of $30,000 in commission. That sounds like a lot. We think that if buyers and sellers start talking to the agents in terms of dollars, not percentages, the agents will be more willing to negotiate and perhaps reduce their prices.
I can't imagine anybody saying, I'm willing to pay you $25,000, but not $26,500. I just don't see that as being a way that people negotiate. I don't think buyers and sellers are comfortable with that. I think that's another reason why the percentages have been so strong. Also, there's this question. It's not the difference of buying a $200,000 house and $1 million house where that percentage is going to be a very big thing. If you say, well, I'll pay you $5,000, if you help me buy a $200,000 house, okay, maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. But to say that for $1 million house certainly wouldn't. There's just a different level that goes into that. Same thing on the seller's side. When you start to unpack what sellers agents actually do, I do think that sellers agents should be willing to take a lot less unless they actually go to the house and do showings. A lot of times they just put lock boxes on and they let the buyer's agent go in and unlock the house and go through the house and turn on the lights and show the property. My feeling is your seller's agent isn't actually worth the money or very much of the money if that's how they're going to handle it. For me, it's a question of what are the services that are being provided and how do you make that work over a period of time in a very hot market where homes are staying on the market for maybe 20 minutes versus 6 to 9 months. The amount of money that people are getting for that as an agent would vary based on the time and the temperature, let's say, of the marketplace. So a lot of things have to go into consideration, I think, before you start having a real conversation about what compensation is appropriate.
Well, I think that if people start thinking and talking about this in terms of dollars, it's going to effectively change the whole marketplace culture. And we're talking about potentially very large sums of money here. You bring the percentage down from 3 to 2%. You could easily save $5,000 on a more expensive home, $10,000. So, and not everybody's going to do this, but to the extent that a significant minority, and particularly people who are influencers, do this, I think it's going to actually loosen up the pricing a bit over time.
I agree with Steve 100%. If you don't ask for a discount, you will never get a discount. So you might as well ask and then decide if that's the person you still want to have representing you at full price or if there's somebody else who might be able to do almost as good a job for you for a little less.
Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Clearly a lot of moving parts here, and things are sure to change as time goes on. That's why I put a number of links in the show notes to help you dig deeper into all of this. I want to thank our guest, Steve Brobeck, a senior fellow at the Consumer Federation of America. You can find them on the web at consumerfed.org. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
And real estate and personal finance expert Ilyce Glink. You can find her online at thinkglink.com.
It's always a pleasure, Herb.
Well, that's it for this edition of Consumerpedia. We hope you'll rate this episode and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Remember, we release new episodes every other Thursday. Another way you can support this show is to follow us on Consumerpedia on Facebook and Instagram, and at My Consumerpedia on Twitter. I'm Herb Weisbaum. Thanks for listening.
Consumerpedia is a public service of checkbook.org. We're a unique nonprofit that helps you save money and make smarter choices. You can count on Checkbook to help you find the best services and avoid the worst, with local ratings that are accurate and unbiased. If you live in or around these 7 cities and haven't joined Checkbook yet, check us out. Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis-St. Paul, and Washington, D.C. To get your free 30-day subscription, go to checkbook.org/consumerpedia. If you like what you've heard, we hope you'll become a supporter by using the link at the bottom of the show notes to make a small contribution each month. Consumerpedia, empowering consumers to save money and make smarter choices.